Manco, terrestrial ecologist for the Department of Environment and Coastal Resources in the Turks and Caicos Islands government. And I'm trying to be at the same depth from the screen as my coworker here, otherwise one of us will disappear. Would you like to introduce yourself, or do you want me to? Okay. This is, many of you know, Junel Blaise, better known as Flash. He's also here with me, and we were at the last conference together. And hopefully next time we'll be there in person. So I'm going to start my presentation just now. And slideshow from beginning. Okay, right. So, can you see my presentation? Has it popped up?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, brilliant. We did figure out there's a little tiny bit of a lag, so let me know, holler if I'm way ahead of what my slides look like, please, if they're not changing. We're going to talk today about balancing the scale, 15 years of pine rockland conservation in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and it is a little shorter than the line of the Rockland group itself, but we were lucky to get in as early as we did and learn a lot and make a lot of good connections. So I'll tell you today about a little bit about the Turks and Caicos Islands for those of you who are familiar, and our pine rocklands, which we call pine yards here. That's a term used in Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. I'll tell you about the history of the Caicos Pine Recovery Project, and finally the habitat restoration and recovery to where we are now, which is some quite good news. So first, just to talk about us, Turks and Caicos Islands, we are a overseas territory of the United Kingdom, one of, I believe, 14 remaining territories. We have about 38,000 people on 9 inhabited islands and keys. And geographically, we're at the southeasternmost end of the Caicos archipelago, which we share with the Bahamas. And we are about 150 kilometers directly north of Haiti, which is reflected in the population here. About 30% of the population is from Haiti or has their roots there. And Creole is the second language to English here. I'll just point out the closer view of the islands. The bulk of the population lives on Providenciales. Of that 38,000, about 27,000 of them live on Providenciales. And only 3 islands in Turks and Caicos have pine, which is Pine Key, North Caicos, and Middle Caicos. The largest area of pine is on Middle Caicos. And we are on North Caicos right now. We're just about directly north of the R in the word north there, that little sort of light area you can see of disturbance. That's the settlement that we are in, which is called Q settlement. Just quickly show, this is an image some of you will have seen before of the pine rocklands and where they occur in the Turks and Caicos. So Pine Key has the green extent on Pine Key. On North Caicos, we've lost a lot of that actual pine, but the habitat remains, the geological habitat remains. And on Middle Caicos, there are several pine yards. The red polygons are our core conservation areas, the areas that we focus most of our management in the pine yard. So some things about our pine rocklands that make them different from those both in South Florida and in the northern Bahamas. Ours are very, very dry pine rocklands. The trees are much smaller than they are in the northern Bahamas and Florida, so they're about 5 to 10 meters, rarely more than that. And a mix of broadleaf and palmetto understory on North and Middle Caicos. And on that situation, they are on rock. It's very dense limestone, unlike the very porous limestone that you have in South Florida. Our limestone doesn't have holes in it that you can stick your fingers in like you have there. It's just very, very dense. The Pine Key population, grows on sand rather than rock, and the understory is represented of dune plants, including sawgrass and palmettos. And I just have a list of some of the species on the left there that we see in Middle and North Caicos pine yard associated with the pine. A lot of the sea grape and pigeon plum species, Cocoloba, Diversifolia, Swartzii, Krugii, lots of mahogany, wild sapodilli, poisonwood, plant called Heterosavia bahamensis. I'm not sure that that occurs in Florida. I think that's an archipelago endemic. And then Arnodia, or golden creeper, the thatch palm, Lysoloma, the wild, I think you call wild tamarind up there, cabbage palm, or what we call big top or white top, and the Pithecolobium. And then for herbs, we have the Cassytha, very, very common in all the pine yards. We have Rhynchospora floridensis as the main ground cover sort of herb. We have some smilax species. Angadenia berteroi is very, very plentiful with the yellow flowers. And then we have 4 orchids that occur in the pine yard. Encyclia altissima, rufa, inaguensis, and Corellii. Corellii being more or less restricted to pine yard in Turks and Caicos. Pine key, the species representation is very different. We have very, very thick, dense understory, mainly of Strumpfia marittima. And I always say when we're clearing areas to mimic fire on pine key and we're clearing out, you know, acres of dense Strumpfia marittima, our partners in the keys would be horrified. But it is very, very common here. Brichycalus americana is another one that grows up with that on the lower areas of the sand. The wild guava, Mosera longipes, your familiar locust berry, Bersonema lucida, and again, the wild sapodilli. We have Mercian floridensis growing on pine key. It's just about the only place in Turks and Caicos it grows. Lots of sawgrass, an interesting small tree that we call wax tree or candle tree, Phyllanthus myrtoloides. We have the Antaria, Stenospermum myrtifolium, and then we have the endemic Encyclia in the pine key pine yard, Encyclia caicensis. If you join me for the virtual tour next week, you'll get to see the Encyclia orchids, and ours are very different from your Encyclia tampensis, which is tiny. Our Encyclias are massive. Right, so just as a quick image of the pine yard in North Caicos, much of this is degraded now. We don't have pine very common in any of those areas. There are just a few dozen individuals left, unfortunately. But on Middle Caicos, the pine yards are still holding their own, despite all of the challenges they've been dealt. And this is an image of a typical pine yard in Middle or North Caicos. You can see that the rock is very dense and smooth like pavement. There's the herb layer there of the various sedges and the bushes, and it's quite an open habitat. These trees are some mature trees and some recovering. And this is a good example of a very well recovering area of our pine yard. You can see all the sea grape and the Cassytha in there. And then pine key pine yard, basically just that top polygon is left with pine, not the bottom one. And this is very typical of pine key pine yard. You can see the understory is much denser and higher, and it's mostly Strumpfia and sawgrass. And there's that yellowy sort of straight up and down plant on the left there is the candlewood, the Phyllanthus myrtoloides. And this is another example of a stand of pine on pine key with a dense, high understory. So just to give you an idea of what has happened in our pine yards, in 2005, I believe this photo was taken on a Sony Mavica, so I apologize for the lack of density of pixels. But this was a research project that we had for biodiversity management in Middle Caicos, and there are colleagues there from Fairchild Gardens, from Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and from the UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum and CABI Bioscience International. And this is when the scale insect was first found. We noticed there was a problem, something that was observed by Dr. Martin Hamilton from Kew Gardens and brought to our attention that the first time we went out to study the pine habitat, we already found this problem. And that is what we found. And this is something that 5 years before had not really been present in the pine yard as far as we could tell, but it was covering most of the trees, and it's a pine tortoise scale. It is a scale insect that comes from North America, and we believe that it was introduced to Turks and Caicos Islands on cut Christmas trees that were imported because it is a pine obligate pest. It quickly went through our habitats, and between 2005 and 2010, about 90% of the pines in all the populations died from the infestation. This is a pest that doesn't cause this kind of devastation in native habitat, but that's an area with long winters, which we don't have, of course. So it constantly is active and breeding here. By 2015, over 97% of the pines were dead. North Caicos suffered a specifically bad loss when in 2008, Hurricane Hannah put 3 feet of salt water into the pine yard and killed the trees that were weakened by the scale. And then a very devastating dry season wildfire in the following dry season that was fueled by all those dead trunks destroyed the seed bank in North Caicos. So North Caicos has had particularly bad hit. This photo is actually from Middle Caicos in 2008 when the problem was really, really at its height. And so moving on to the Caicos Pine Recovery Project, this is sort of going to be a timeline of what we did and how we did it and what happened. As I mentioned, that first project that we had, the Biodiversity Management Project, allowed us to partner with various organizations, especially Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and to develop further projects. So the first project we had was a 2-year project starting in 2008, which was us and which was Turks and Caicos National Trust, which I worked for at the time, along with my colleague Junel, and Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, funded by the Turks and Caicos Islands Government Conservation Fund. And that really was working on establishing some very quick mapping extent of damage, population counts, as well as ex situ conservation efforts. The next project that we got was actually initiated by Royal Botanic Gardens Kew and the Department of Environment and Coastal Resources in the Turks and Caicos Islands government, DECR. And Flash and I actually moved from the National Trust into DECR at that point. So we began a program that was a project that was funded by the Overseas Territories Environment Program. That was from 2010 to 2013 with Kew Gardens as one of the lead agencies on that. Following that, 2014 to 2016, we were awarded a Darwin Plus Overseas Territories Environment and Climate Fund project. And this was specifically looking at setting out a scientifically based restoration strategy for Caicos pine. And this, the main partner on this was Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and did a lot of work with us. And concurrently, Kew was able to secure a grant from the John Ellerman Foundation in the UK, which funded the sociocultural research, the community outreach, the Caicos Pine Yard Trail, and native plant gardens, which were all part of making sure that people knew about the problem of the pine and the work that we were doing. I do want to mention here, I didn't say this earlier, it was on the slide, the Caicos pine is our national tree. And it is, we call it Caicos pine. It's supposed to be Caribbean pine, but because it only grows in the Caicos Islands here, not the Turks Islands, we call it Caicos pine. Through the years, we've had a number of really amazing partners, support agencies and individuals, including Royal Botanic Gardens Kew and the Millennium Seed Bank. They've really been the ones that have held our hand the whole way through this, have gotten amazing expertise here, and are tireless partners with this work. The Turks and Caicos National Trust, of course, was the original partner on it here. The U.S. Forest Service, the Bahamas National Trust, Bahamas Forestry Unit, the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the University of South Sewanee have been particularly useful in collaborating with us on the controlled burn program of initiating a prescribed fire routine here in Turks and Caicos, and doing all of the training, as well as helping us out with the actual burns. We've also had sort of informal partnerships more recently with Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden, Montgomery Botanical Center. Through the years, both have helped us out with various things, including places to stay and some research and sort of demonstration things. And then, of course, the Pine Rocklands Working Group, which we've been involved in with since, I believe, 2008. And finally, of course, our very dear Joy Klein from Miami-Dade County Parks, who helps us out with housing and lots of other wonderful things when we are there for the conferences. So I was hoping to see Joy here in Turks and Caicos this year, but apparently the microbiology of the world has had other plans in mind, and that won't be possible. Things that we have established under these programs include the Caicos Pine and Native Plant Nursery, which an upper right flash is inventorying there. The Caicos Pine annual seed collections every October, which we then bank in Millennium Seed Bank and keep our collections and grow them. The controlled burn program, the middle lower photo, includes 2 of the burn plots that we started in 2012. The Caicos Pine Seed Orchard, so that is a program of growing pine in an agricultural area for seed bulking or growing seeds specifically to plant more trees in the future. Those trees have just recently become productive. The core conservation areas for management, the permanent monitoring plots where we do fire exclusion for long-term monitoring, the Caicos Pine Yard Trail, which we will tour you all around next week. Diamond Jubilee Pine Yard, which is one of our restoration areas where we've planted pine out. And then the education program, including Caicos Pine Awareness Week and the Q Settlement annual Christmas tree lighting event. So rather than having a pine tree cut and imported for a Christmas tree, we have planted a few Caicos pines in the middle of Q Settlement in North Caicos. And we have a big education and community event every year for the Christmas tree lighting. The project engaged lots of different specialities for the work that we were doing. And I just want to point out, when we talked about the encyclia earlier, that's an encyclia altissima between 2 of our colleagues from Kew Gardens. So you can see they're quite big things. And a few of the important findings that were made included in genetics, significant difference between Turks and Caicos and Bahamas populations, as well as significant difference between the middle and north population and the Pine Key population, and a documented loss of several of the alleles in the wild, some of which were saved in the seed orchard. We looked at seed production, quality, and germination. Of course, with fewer trees, there's less pollen. With weak trees, there are fewer cones and fewer seeds, and the germination rate was not very good in general. But what we did find was that they do have some storage capacity, so we are able to bank the seeds, which is good. Q's GIS department did amazing mapping for us based on color, red edge, and infrared aerial imagery with this rather sinister looking drone that flew over us for a couple of weeks. And we got really good information, including micro elevation sort of areas there, as well as vegetative health. Combined with that, we looked at the water stress and the nitrogen levels and showed that the North Caicos trees were the most stressed, the Pine Key the second, and the Middle Caicos least. And the study basically predicted over the next 20 years, quasi-extinction of pine in North Caicos. Pine Key and Middle Caicos would be stabilized to an altered forest structure, but they would probably survive. And that's sort of what we're seeing happen now. Although the Middle Caicos trees get to that, they look like they're changing back to what they should be. As well as looking at the pine tortoise scale, we looked at other plant pests. There's another Mediterranean black aphid that lives on the pine trees now that's an imported pest. It doesn't seem to do significant damage, but we're watching it. And one of our entomological partners there, Dr. Chris Malumphy, he found over 200 quarantine level pests already established in Turks and Caicos. We only got a Department of Agriculture in 2005, and prior to that, basically plants and trees were imported without any real restrictions. But Dr. Mlumphy also found a new species of mealybug on our sedge roots, which was interesting. So not all of these pest insects are necessarily bad. One of the most fascinating things for me in the project was looking at the mycology. The pine depends on 7 species of ectomycorrhizal fungi, including Rhizopogon phoscorubens, which is that thing that looks like a creepy little hand in the lower left corner of the top photo. And there were, sea grape was a prize with 11 species of ectomycorrhizal fungi, and one that it shares with the pine. Looking at fire ecology and training for controlled burns, we've actually done 3 different controlled burn events in several different plots. And the US Forest Service and US Department of Defense have been very key in helping us with this. And I just want to point out that that's on the left photo there. That is Junel Blaise, who's next to me right now. His last name really is Blaise. And he has become he's our burn prodigy for sure. He's really doing excellent at learning these techniques, and hopefully we'll be able to employ them someday with a team locally here. So along with these things, we had Q's Jodrell Laboratory come and look at the volatile chemicals that trees are producing, specifically those that can be insecticidal. What we found was that in healthy pines, the trees do produce these insecticidal compounds. They don't necessarily produce them in unhealthy trees. And that's something that was important to note, because they can fight the scale off if they want to. Some of the trees were doing it all along. Others just couldn't seem to produce enough or as long as they needed to get rid of the scale insect. All of the research that was done and the work that was done culminated in 2016 in the Caicos Pine Recovery Project National Tree Restoration Strategy, along with 3 supporting documents, including the protocols of ex situ conservation, the scientific data and results, and a sociocultural history report. These all can be found on ResearchGate, and you can contact me if you would like the links to them. So with all of that research, data, work on the ground that we put into place, it was about time to see some restoration happening. And the first real restoration that we initiated was the Diamond Jubilee Pine Yard in Pine Key. It's called that because it was planted during the week of Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on the throne, and also happened to be during World Biodiversity Week. So in 2012, we set out the plots. This is an area where I mentioned earlier where we cleared lots of things, including Strumpfia. We can't burn in Pine Key because of the housing there. It's mostly wood, and it's a very, very fire suppressed community, so it would be quite dangerous to burn. But we cleared a lot of the broadleaf species, and we planted out pine pretty much every year between 2012 and 2017. And they did really well. And the other things have come back too. So this is actually a photo that was taken by a friend of mine yesterday on Pine Key, and it's actually beginning to look like what the Pine Key pine yards look like. It's a bit more broadleaf than I would like to see, and would like to get in there and maybe help it out a bit. But the trees that we planted out are doing really well, and they're growing up, and some of them are already fertile. But what about North and Middle Caicos? Well, North Caicos, having looked at it again and again with the saline groundwater from the sea incursion and the real risk of fire there with all of the palm that has come back into the habitat after the first wildfire, we realized it may be somewhat of a lost cause. We're keeping an eye on it for the future, but we're going to go for the low-hanging fruit first. And so we're working on Middle Caicos, and this is again a photo from Middle Caicos. We did the burn in 2012. There were lots of seedlings out there, sort of 18 inches high or under 2 feet high, and they were mostly covered thoroughly with scale insect, and the mature trees were all pretty much dead. So following this burn, we did see recovery of those seedlings in terms of they at least were able to grow. They were able to put on lots of growth. They had been tiny stunted seedlings for years due to the scale insect, but they suddenly were able to grow. And so they were responding to the nutrients in the soil or the lack of competition or whatever it was, probably a combination. But importantly, they were still covered with scale insect. You can see in this photo, the foreground tree there has lots of white spots on the needles, and that was actually one of the healthier trees. If you look behind it to the right, that tree looks like it has that snowy flocking on it that they sell for Christmas trees, and that's the scale insect, really heavy infestation. And the trees just were not fighting it off. They were growing, and some of them grew quite high, but they were continuing to be badly infested and die from the scale infestation. So you can imagine, after many, many years of work, lots of hours in the pine yard, which is one of our least pleasant habitats to be in due to the heat and the mosquitoes and the lack of shade, etc. And over $1 million, lots of working hours from lots of people internationally. So lots of, it was a carbon heavy series of projects. The trees now had, in several areas, they had been given the opportunity by clearance broadly around. They had been given the burn. We had a respite from hurricanes for several years. We had some really good rain cycles, and yet the trees were still covered with scale. And I remember being in the pine yard with Junel, and there he is admonishing one of the little trees for not growing. What's wrong with you? Why can't you fight the scale off? And I said, it's really hard to continue to help someone who doesn't seem to want to be helped. It was really discouraging. And I remember saying a rather, perhaps a bit of hubris, that Naqqi helps those who help themselves. In the pine yard, I said, these trees are just not getting it. They can produce the insecticidal compounds. Why are they not doing it? Well, we still don't know, but perhaps saying it out loud made a point, because around 2016, a change began to happen. And the trees began not only to grow more quickly, but also they began to fight the scale off. So this is the same view in 2012 and 2020. So up until sort of 2015, 2016, those trees were all still quite small and covered with scale. And then in 2016, 2017, they began to grow a bit, but in 2018, they really took off, and they almost dropped their scale off of them. We actually started to see a lot more natural predators moving in, including ladybird beetles that are both native and not, lacewings, and a parasitoid wasp. So that was really good. So this has been an amazing change for us. This is the same area again on the two photos in 2012, right before the burn was done. You can see how even that little plant there between Joe O'Brien and Ben Hornsby in the foreground is covered with scale. And that's pretty much how they remained after the burn for some time. But then on the right, you can see the trees have just come out of almost nowhere. They've really grown up well. And this is a little burn plot that we did after the first two in 2012 that had, again, lots of little seedlings, but they were all just completely festooned with scale. They remained that way up until about 2016. And in 2016, 2017, some of these trees that were there on the right were just completely still covered by scale. And then all of a sudden, boom, it seemed to be gone. So they're doing something. They whether they heard us or what, I don't know, but they'd like to find out what that is, what happened there. So this is actually just taken on last Friday. This is what the second burn plot looks like now. So for our partners in the UK who haven't been here for a while, that's what we're looking at. Really nice recovering trees, sort of 5 meters and upward, and they're beginning to, some of them have already produced fertile cones. And this tree on the right side of the photo produced fertile cones in 2018, and then again in 2019 they opened, and it dropped quite a bit of seed. It was not something we expected to see. It's a rather small tree, but Junel has amazing eyes for finding seedlings. If you've ever been in the pine yard with him, you know he can see a pine seedling with 2 needles on it from 100 feet away. And that's what he did. He found, you know, I had him point at it because otherwise you can't see it in the photo. He found this little tiny seedling, and this is the first seedling we found in Middle Caicos since 2010, and it had siblings. So this was really exciting. This was in December of 2019 that this tree was found, and so we've been keeping an eye on it as well as some of its siblings. And in fact, just last week, Friday, we went to visit it, and you can see Junel is holding it in his hand there. Cleared some of the other grasses away from it to give it a little more exposure, and it's doing really well. It's growing. There's its mother on the right, and so we do have some changes happening that are showing us that something is clicked. Finally, the trees have decided that they're going to survive, and that's really making us happy because honestly, they were the last ones to join the party. You know, they didn't see themselves as part of the team until recently. So something happened that they've jumped into the pool and they're ready to recover now. So just that's the little seedling, the sort of our inspiration for the future. There are others growing up in the habitat, and we will be looking for more at the end of this year when the seeds for October begin to shed. So if you'd like to contact me about the ResearchGate documents, if you haven't had a chance to see them, that is my email address there, and feel free to contact me. And that is what I have for you today. So I'm happy to take any questions if you like.
So Naqqi, if you want, I can help tell you. There's already some stuff in the chat if you want me to kind of read it out to you.
Okay.
Okay, let me go back to the beginning. From Kim Heiss, she asks, why is the limestone dense with no holes?
Right. As far as we know, as far as I know, I'm not a geologist, but as far as I know, it's because of the rain. Basically, we don't have the rainfall. We only have about, I believe, 27 inches of rainfall, 29 inches of rainfall annually average. So we're kind of on the edge of being desert, and we also don't have the extreme flow of groundwater. So our islands are quite low and flat, but the groundwater is not moving the way it does in Florida. So that's the only thing I can think of, is we don't have that extreme erosion going on. We do have caves here and solution holes, but they're not sort of the same way that they are in Florida. They're a lot older in terms of their geology, and they are primarily formed by the sulfuric acid that precipitates out of the halocline between the saltwater and the freshwater tables. But yeah, it's very, very dense limestone. You can sort of cut it into blocks and use it very solid for building and things.
Yeah, we have some geologists, I think, on this call who are totally fascinated by what you just said. So Jen Posley put some links to the documents that Naqqi mentioned. And then let me see if I find any questions. I'm not really seeing any more of the questions. So this is your time, guys.
Scott Johnson has a question in the chat.
Okay, I'm looking for it. Okay, I wonder if the resistance to the scale insect is a result of a recent mutation, was Scott Johnson's comment.
Yeah, well, that's what we were expecting to happen, is of course that trees that were naturally resistant, as I mentioned, there were some that were naturally resistant. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get, if Flash and I are not exactly at the same distance from the camera, one of us disappears, and it's usually, So trying to keep him there. Yeah, so we knew that there would be a genetic bottleneck happening, and because of that, we really tried hard to preserve other trees that were not necessarily looking that great and that weren't resistant to scale. But we figured that that's what was going to happen in the wild. But a lot of the trees that are out there that are growing were there from the time that the scale arrived and had scale on them and were just stunted for years and years. And suddenly they just began to protect themselves against the scale. So they had the capacity to begin with. However, the trees that we have in our nursery and the trees that we planted out on Pine Key, those are trees that we grew from seeds from trees that were healthy despite the scale. So those are probably a lot narrower of a genetic sample. So yeah, I think that we're going to see that being a mutation that is more common, whatever it is that helps them survive it. But this most recent thing of them, even trees that existed back then, suddenly deciding that they were going to kill the scale, I had no idea. Would love to know what it is though.
So, anybody else? I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh, they're popping up. From Pro Terry, which is Terry Glancy?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Hello. Yeah.
He asks, how are you planting the pines? Digging bars, rotating hammer drill?
Okay, so the only place that we've planted them out in the wild so far is Pine Key, which is really easy because it's sand. And even where it's kind of lithified sand, you can still get through it with a shovel or a pickaxe quite easily. So the work for planting the trees on Pine Key has been very easy. Where we have our seed orchard, it's land that was tilled for farming about 40 years ago. And we've just had to basically use that layer of topsoil which was existing there for agricultural purposes. And unlike a proper habitat restoration, for that situation, it's okay if it's been rock plowed. We wouldn't want to do that in the pine yard. Now, in terms of planting out in Middle Caicos, when we have an opportunity to do that, that's going to be a challenge. And we've definitely found that we don't want to grow the trees in the nursery any larger than 3-gallon pots, but the survivorship of plants in 1-gallon pots planted out to the wild is very, very low. So we need to get them basically when they're in 3-gallon pots to where they're sapling size with branches about 1 meter tall. That's the ideal size to plant them out. But we don't want them to have a really, really deep root mass as well, because we just won't find the ground for it. The good thing is that there's a lot of potholes of soil in the pine yard, and once the trees get into it, as you know, they just kind of grow in their own little pot. So yeah, that's how we do that.
Okay, next question was from Leslie McConaughey. She asked, overcoming scales, could it be related to the fires?
I think so. I think there's a lot to be said about the fire having encouraged the trees to grow, and it took them a while. The scale definitely responded to the fire in the way that we hoped, which was that it didn't like to be burned, but it did come back with a vengeance afterward. And I'm wondering, maybe there could have been something that happened, that it just took a while for those nutrients to be absorbed by the trees, and took a while for the trees to figure out what to do with them to make whatever they needed to make that killed the scale. But it was the burning was doubtlessly beneficial. And funny enough, the local communities in North and Middle Caicos, they were all for it. We didn't have the challenge that you have in South Florida, because we don't have that dense population. North Caicos has 1,300 people. Middle Caicos has about 100. Pine Key has about 80 people that actually live there. And so although we can't burn on Pine Key, we can burn on the other islands, because unlike Miami Rockridge, here, nobody lives in the pine yard except for Pine Key. North and Middle Caicos, nobody would be crazy enough to build their house in as inhospitable a place as the pine yard. So that's been really good, is we can burn there, provided we have the technical support. The government and the neighbors, and especially the local people of North and Middle Caicos, have been very, very excited for us to continue to set it on fire. And they've told us they want us to.
That's incredible. Gwen asked, could it have been the length of time since the last major environmental stress that made a difference in whether the trees could fight the scale also?
Yeah, it could have, I suppose. The trees, when I first started working in Middle Caicos in 2000, the pine yard trees were all very uniform, and there was a good variety of ages, but there was also a really good fire record. And it looked to me and to our other partners, I think, as though they really hadn't suffered any terrible catastrophes for a long time. Our trees recover very quickly from hurricanes. The only time they really don't do well is if they're actually toppled over, if the root mass breaks, or if the main trunk breaks. But they bend like crazy, and they just pop back up when they're done. So it looked like they had a cushy existence, even though they're living sort of at the edge of their tolerance for habitat and climate in the archipelago. They seemed like they had a cushy existence for a while.
So the next one is from Barbara McAdam. Was there a change in resin content, and maybe smoke could change the scale without burning? And then she made a comment, and maybe the trees just needed to develop stronger root systems to support nutrient and water uptake. Yeah,
that's entirely possible. Like I said, they sat there for years doing nothing with scale all over them, and then suddenly, boom, they were happy. So I don't know that. I mean, we looked at the water stress in the trees, but we didn't really look at the resin itself in terms of whether that was something that was changing over time. I know, I would say historically, the trees used to bleed a lot more resin than they do now. So 20 years ago, you used to see trees that were damaged that had lots and lots of sap coming out of them. But you don't see that really anymore. If they're damaged, they seem to want to seal it up pretty quickly. But yeah, the smoke definitely did something to the scale. They didn't like it, and immediately after the burn, there was no scale for a while, and then all of a sudden they just come right back. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me take a moment really quick. Joy, is that something that you've noticed in ours? I'm sorry, it's just like a side note, but.
Yeah, I've actually taken a torch to scale and watch the scale run for their lives. So yeah, they don't like scale at all. They know it's going to kill them, but the problem is, if you have so much pine scale around you, even though the little ones may get burned, and then you still have the infestation source coming in. But with our pines, they just grow really, really slow at first, and then after they've been in the ground like 5 years is when they really shoot up. So it might be just part of the morphology of the pines. We always said that was an adaptation for fireproofing. They would stay very close to the ground and get very thick trunks to help insulate the vascular tissue. And then they would kind of all of a sudden at age 4 or 5 shoot up and start growing very fast. So, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm sure your pines are even more stressed than ours. So
yeah, and ours never really do that thing with the grassy phase. They like yours do. They definitely look like little tiny trees with the skinny trunk, and yeah, but they can sit like that for a decade. So I don't think it would be a great thing for them to get burned like that, but they can definitely do it. They can sit around like that.
Yeah. Okay. So Terry made a comment that said survival of even smaller pine tubulings is really difficult without irrigation.
that's our main challenge, I think, to planting out in Middle Caicos is getting water to where we need to get it to for the trees is a massive amount of labor. Even if it was setting up a tank. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt myself. I'm rehabilitating a brown booby right now that got a damaged foot, and it's showing us it's ready to leave because it just walked into the room. I don't know how it got out of where it's meant to be in, but I'm watching carefully because it bites really badly. It's a massive seabird walking around the living room. Sorry about that. So if you see us looking, that's watching the thing. It's right behind me now. Yeah, we getting water to those trees in Middle Caicos is a challenge. Even to sort of set up a tank or a tower out there and an irrigation system requires a great deal of labor. On Pine Key, we have a well dug right in the restoration area, so we can just haul water out in buckets out and carry it to the trees. And then on the government farm, we have an irrigation pipe, so we just use a hose when we need to. But yeah, Middle Caicos is going to be a bit of a nightmare whenever we in the future look at restoration areas there.
Barbara McAdams asked, she was wondering what your rainy season is, or do they at least have a rain season more optimal for planting?
Yeah. So normally we divide the year into hurricane season and non-hurricane season, or what's been co-opted as tourist season. So generally the rain is coming in the hurricane season. Starting around May is when we'll get the first rain, have more heavy in June, and then it slacks off a bit until usually about September, October, we'll get a lot more rain. Our rainiest months, sorry, the booby is climbing a ladder behind me. The rainiest months are October and November, definitely. And that is our optimal time for planting if we can. But we definitely plant within hurricane season to make sure that they're going to get some rain. Typically between late January and April, we will go through years where we will see no rain at all in those months. So that's our dry season.
Okay. MD Sanchez says, are you noticing a reduction in the amount of scale insects after the decline in number of trees?
We were, and then when the trees began recovering and little saplings been growing up, the scale sort of came up to meet them around 2016, 2015, 2016, and 2017. And then that's when the scale seems to have taken a nosedive. So something happened at some point where the trees are now, there's loads of trees out there. There's lots and lots of saplings that are sort of between like 2 and 4 meters tall, maybe. And they're almost all clean. Yeah.
Scott Johnson said, nice one. And then I think it was the booby. And then Christy Cadavecchio, she asked, how about pH? Maybe they need old pine needles to decompose to help make nutrients available.
It's probably a factor. That's about the only thing out there giving them any nutrients. There's very, very little organic matter that isn't tied up in living tissue. So we don't, when we do cut vegetation to help remove competition from pine where we don't burn, we pile it in the area, but we don't remove it from the site totally. Our soil needs all the help it can get, for sure. And I see, I'm seeing the chat now that what would, from Terry, what would ideal fire frequency be? I think we said about 15 years for most of our pine yards. And what we're seeing is that the area that we burned in 2012 looks to me like it could probably stand to be burned. It doesn't have to be burned now, but it could burn if we wanted. You agree with that? Yeah. And I think Flash is more eager to burn it than I am. But yeah, it could be about every 15 years. So probably 10 to 15 years would be fine. And we want to see the booby. I will get her on a stick because I can't pick her up. She'll bite my arm in a minute. Yeah. Yeah, I see one about eucalyptus. Marlene Krantz says, I spray my pines with eucalyptus oil and soap and water. Is that okay? Yeah, we had an area where we were looking at pesticide application. It didn't have much effect on the scale insect that we're dealing with, the types of pesticides that we used, because we didn't want to be that destructive in the habitat. But definitely soapy water, just soap and water sprayed on them and then left to dry for 2 hours and then washed off so that you're actually suffocating the scale rather than poisoning it. That works very well, and we use that in our nursery. And what we use neem oil, don't we? Neem oil works quite well. And what's the other? We found a couple of systemics that were quite lanate, but it was effective. Yeah, lanate. We're not allowed to use it anymore, but it was very effective. And what's the other one? Dinazone. Yeah. So those, in terms of, if you really have a problem, but we don't like to use those in the wild areas. We wouldn't want them out there. And do you do any mycorrhizal inoculation from Dr. Eric Salamanca, also in our department? Right, not deliberately, but we can attest that to this fella here. We were growing the pine in ProMix, in potting mix. And we were still seeing seedlings about 60% mortality from when we germinated seeds to when they were in 1 gallon pots. We were seeing a massive mortality. And then one day we ran out of potting mix, and Junel just started digging up local soil to use as the potting mix. And that changed everything. The plants that were planted in local soil mixed with peat moss began growing amazingly well. And then we began incorporating soil from the pine yard. We didn't even have to look for the mycorrhizae. We just needed to put a couple of handfuls in. So the spores are there. And now when we unpot trees in the nursery, they've all got tons of mycorrhizae on them. And in fact, if you see a tree that isn't healthy, you can almost 100% of the time guarantee that it's the mycorrhizae that's failed, hasn't it? We dig those up and they've got no fungus on them. And then Dodley, oh, hello. Yes, from Grand Turk. Because the TCI is relatively near the Sargassum Sea and has been receiving a lot of dead seaweed washing up on the shores, is there a plan to compost them to use to nourish the pines in the wild? I think it'd be a good idea, almost unlimited source of nutrients. That's actually, that would be an interesting thing to try. I think maybe once the Sargassum is washed, because the pine here really can't take salt, that might be something worth a try, and seeing if even just leaving it there as a compost might help the trees somewhat. So yeah, that's really, I think that's something that will be something worth a try. We do have another project right now looking at possible uses of Sargassum, so that might be something to look into.
So.
Can you get the stick out of the bathroom? It's right inside the door. Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, I left you hanging, Naqqi. My food arrived.
Oh, no problem. No problem. That's important in this day and age.
Yes, but it seems like Barbara and even Joy nodding were really real big fans of using the local soil, because I know right. Joy is always harping on me for that. So.
Yeah, the local soil is important. Flash has got the booby on a stick, so I am going to where's my video? I have to take away my background. You'll see my horrible house, but that's okay. Nice. Do we see it?
Yes.
So that's the booby. Don't hold her that close because she will bite my ear off. Yeah, so that's my brown booby that I've got right now, and I'm hoping that this weekend she might be ready to go because she's gotten very adventurous.
So this is me now, all on my own. What kind of other conservation partners do you guys have down there? Are you like it?
Well,
in the actual, like Turks and Caicos physically.
yeah, so we have in the country, we have the DECR is the government department, and I guess about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it began to shift from being a very sort of rubber stamp agency to a much more interested agency in environment. We began getting people who were interested in Turks and Caicos, not just here to make a paycheck, because back then most of it was international contractors that were doing the technical work. And we have now a staff that is either almost everyone on staff now is either a belonger, which is a citizen of Turks and Caicos, or has a very long-term interest here and has been here, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. So that's been a big change. So from within we get accused in our department of being too biased toward the environment, which is wonderful to hear, because not all environmental departments get that. But we also have the Turks and Caicos National Trust. They've shifted their focus a bit more toward heritage and culture and history, but they also deal a lot with our sort of charismatic fauna. So they work a lot with the iguanas. They have some great projects with international partners on preserving our rock iguanas. And we have another NGO called TCI Reef Fund, which focuses mainly on marine conservation and work. So we have those in Turks and Caicos. Also the National Museum does a bit when they can with environmental things. And that's really about it as far as I can think of. Other than that, I mean, we all work together well, which is good, so we're the partnerships have been getting better, and we have loads of really great international partnerships that have been forged over the years. Much thanks to the UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum represented in the call, who were the original agency that introduced us to all the wonderful friends that we have around the world now doing the work. And that has made us less insular and islandish than we were in the past.
Thank you. And it looks like everyone's just saying thanks at this point in the talk.
Well, thank you. Yes, this was a great opportunity. Next week we have the virtual tour, which I think is on the 29th, is it? 20? Yes, the 29th at 11 a.m. will be the virtual tour of the Caicos Pine Yard Trail. So you'll be able to join us and see exactly what it looks like and see some of the plants and the flowers and everything like that.
I think everyone wants to see your tour much more than our tour. So putting that out there.
We'll be on yours as well. We find things like herb layers fascinating because we don't have them,
Yeah. But all I've been hearing for the past few days is we're gonna get to see the Bahamas and we're gonna get to see Turks and Caicos. I was like, yeah. So thank you guys. It's wonderful. I would venture to say, are we the only folks that are, reaching international borders and crossing all that to, manage an ecosystem?
I think it's safe to say that this is probably one of the most unusual, sort of partnership and ecosystem situations, because of course, I think of like in North America, the environment on the borders of Canada and the US are not terribly different, but they're managed very differently. The habitats on the border of US and Mexico are very similar, but they're managed very differently. But we have a situation where we have non-contiguous borders. We have island borders between the state of Florida, the northern Bahamas, and 400 miles down south, us here in Turks and Caicos. And yet it's such a similar habitat, and we're able to engage the same management techniques. So yeah, I think that's quite something unusual.
So, thank you guys.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay.
And I like how flash is literally flashing on and
Flashing.
off. The whole experience of,
Yeah.
I think
not only does he burn, he flashes on and off.
yeah, I think the last conference I told Joy to start calling me like, fire or some, storm. But it didn't take, I still want my cool nickname.
Well, yeah, that was that. I can tell you, oh, my mother creeps into my professional life all the time, and that's fine because she's brilliant. But she's actually the one that gave Flash the name. She was ordering personalized bath towels from Lillian Vernon, and she said if she gets 2 more, she gets free shipping. And she asked his name, and I told her, and she said, "Oh, I can't spell that." And I said, "I don't want to spell that." And she said, "What's his last name?" And I said, "Blaise." And she said, "Like a flash of lightning." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "All right, well, I'm calling him Flash." And so he liked it, and it stuck.
So did he get towels that say Flash on them?
Does it say Flash? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Janet, be careful what you wish for with a nickname.
Yes.
No,
Yeah.
yes, it's true, but I do want one like Flash, I see Storm. Don't I look like a storm?
Yes. The perfect storm.
If I told you you had a nickname, you'd want to know what it is, what your staff call you. So I'm just going to make you wonder.
Hey, sometimes
Anyway.
I'm called Snow White because I talk to the birds.
I talked to Pine, so there we go. Thank you, Naqqi. It was great seeing you guys. Wish we could be in person. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Thank you.
thanks,
I see a
Brad.
question if the talk's going to be available to watch later. I believe it is. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
On the website. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. See you guys next week.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.